Hi, welcome back. So in this video, we are actually going to be working on the next two functions for our calculator. So in this video, we're going to be working on collecting our user input, and then we're also going to be working on parsing that input. So we'll explain that in just a second. Now, before I get started, I just want to talk a little bit about how functions work. And I know I covered it a little bit at the beginning, but we didn't actually talk about the whole operation. So a function is going to have three parts: the inputs, the main body, and then the outputs. Now we know that we have our inputs and our main body. So for example, this print instructions program doesn't take any inputs, and it has its main body, which just prints out the instructions for our program. But there's also another part that we didn't talk about, which is the outputs. So let's say we want to write a function that multiplies two numbers. Now we're actually going to be doing that later on once we get to the operations part. But pretty much what we can do is actually take in two numbers, so that's our inputs. We have our main body, which runs all of the logic and stuff behind it, and in this case it's just multiplying the numbers, and then we can return the product of those two numbers. So that's going to be our outputs. So we can do this, and this is pretty much just the general theory for all functions. It's kind of how it works. Now we're actually going to start to work with outputs over these next two functions, so that's what we're going to be doing in this video. So let's get started. Before I start writing on any function, I like to kind of think about what I want to achieve by the end of it. So in this case, I want to be able to ask the user to input their command, and then I want to take that input and return it, or I want to output it. So first thing we're going to do is think of a way that we can capture the user's input. Now the easiest way to do this is through the input function, which is a built-in function that allows us to get some text or input from the user. So we're going to just type it out first. Now I'm not going to store it to a variable yet, I'll do that next. And then what we're going to do is input a string here, and what that's going to be is kind of the text before the user inputs. So it's going to be, for example, in this case, enter a command, colon, and then the user can enter their command. So that's what I'm going to type out here. And make sure to always put a space so that there's a space between our input here and the user's command. There we go. But we need a way to actually capture this or store this so that we can return it. Because what's going to happen is the user is going to enter their command, and this input function is going to return or output whatever the user typed in here. So we're going to store this to a variable. So I'm going to say user input, like that, is equal to input. And then what I'm going to do is just return it. So we can do this using the return keyword, and this is just pretty much just going to be a way to specify what we want to output. So I'm going to go user underscore input. There we go. So let's go ahead and test if this works. I'm going to remove this and say get user input. Now I'm going to go ahead and run my program. So it says here enter your command. We can just type in whatever we want for now. We enter it and it quits the program, which is exactly like how it's supposed to work. So the next thing I want to do is work on this parsing function here, which is going to be a little bit more complicated. Pretty much when we want to parse something, we want to kind of break it down into its key components. So in this case, we want to take that command, which is just a string, and we're going to extract all the information we need from it. So first thing I want to do is just change this from string to user input. So I think that would make a lot more sense. And the next thing I want to do is think about how I want to approach this. So the easiest way to do this is to kind of look at how we want to break it down. So I'm actually going to just write a little comment here. So let's say I have the command add 3050. We want this to output, oh, whoops, didn't mean to do that. We want this to output 80, right? So we have add 3050 to 80, but we can't do that with just a string. We need to break this down into different components. So we can see here that we have two major components. We have the operation. So I'm just going to make another comment there. So we're going to have the operation, which is in this case add or multiply or divide. And then the next is the number list. So the next is going to be a list of numbers. So this can be 2 or more, and it's going to be 30 and 50 in this case. So what we want to do is find a way to break down the string and get all of our key components from it. So here's kind of what we want to do, and this is a really good way of breaking down really complex functions, is kind of type out a comment list. So I'm going to say split string into operation and numbers. Split numbers, so remember we're going to have a string for our numbers into, okay, hold on, let me reword this. Make list of numbers that is easy to work with. Because remember, we have a string here and we can't really run math on a string, so we're going to break that down. And the final thing I want to do is create instance of operation class based on what we get from these upper lists here. So let's just look at this one more time. Pretty much the first thing we're going to do is split our string into its operation and numbers. Then we're going to make a list of numbers out of what we have from here. And then we're going to create an instance of our operation class. Now, if you don't know what a list is, I'll cover that in just a second. But let's focus on splitting down our string. So what we're going to do first is create a new variable. So I'm going to say, let's just say something really basic. User operation. This is also going to be temporary, so don't worry about the name so much. User input parsed. Okay, and now what we're going to do here is run user input. So we're going to say dot split. Now pretty much what this is going to do is this is a function that's attached to user input. So split is going to take an input. So in this case I'm going to put space, and what it's going to do is split up our string here on every space, and then it's going to create a list. So a list is pretty much just, well, a list of items. Now you're usually going to find it with square brackets and commas. So for example, A, like this, B, and C. This right here is a list. So this is a list of 3 strings, A, B, and C, and then we can do stuff with this. But in this case, our list is going to look a lot different. So in this case, our list is going to look like this. The first string is going to be add, and the next is going to be 30, 50. Because remember, we're splitting it on our spaces, so we have 2 parts to our list. The next thing we want to do is make a list of numbers. So what we're going to do is take the second element from our list. Now the easiest way to do this is to use the index, which is the position. Now the index of an item always starts from 0. So this is going to be item 0 and item 1. Now because we know that user input parsed is a list, what we can do is go like that, put square brackets around it, and say 1. So this is a way of accessing the index of something on a list. So when I run this, this is going to grab the second element, or the item with the first index. The next thing I want to do is split this one on a comma, because remember, we have 30, 50. And we're going to store this to another variable. So we're going to say user input numbers. This is kind of stretching off the screen a little bit, so I'll just see that. So we're splitting this on a comma. But the next thing we want to do is actually go through and convert this into something that we can work with. So what we're going to do is use a for loop. Now a for loop is pretty much just going to go through, hold on, let me just show you what the list will look like here. So a for loop is going to go through some iterable item. So an iterable item is pretty much, just think of it as something that can be looped over, or where you can go over each element. So a list is iterable, so you can go 30, 50, and you're going to go through each item and then do something with it. So the way to write a for loop is for, and then you're going to type some random variable name. So I'm just going to say for number in numbers, user input numbers. So what this is saying is for every number, now this can be a name for anything, it's just a placeholder for whatever item you're on, in some list. Now what it's going to do is go through and do something with each number. In this case, what we want to do is set the number. So for example, if we're on 30, we want to change it to a number and not a string. So the easiest way to do that is say int number. So what this is pretty much saying is for every number, change it to the number version or the integer version of whatever we're specifying. So first it goes through 30, the string, and changes it to 30, the number, and then it does the same with 50. And if we have more items in the list, it's going to do it with all of them as well. So there we go. We have that set up. We have our user input parsed. So that's going to be our list of our operation and our basic numbers. And then we have our user input numbers. And after we run this operation, it's going to give us the number version of this list. So 30 and 50 without the quotations that are usually given to a string. The last thing we want to do is create an instance of an operation class and return it. So remember, we're going to output it. So the way to create an instance of a class is to go and type the name of the class. So in this case, it's operation, then put brackets around it. Now what you're going to do is pass in everything that you need to create this class or this box of items. So if we look at our init function, which is kind of our initializer, what we need to get everything set up, it takes in 2 inputs, not 3, because this is the self. It's referring to the instance that it's on. It only needs 2. So what we're going to do is pass in the operation that we want. So in this case, it's add and the number list. So let's go ahead and do that now. First thing we want to do is store it to a variable. So I'm going to say operation is equal to, and then we're creating an instance. So the first thing we want to pass in is user input parsed. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and make sure to set 0 to get the first element from this list, which is add. And the next thing I want to do is set the second to our number list. So it's going to be user input numbers. And finally, the last thing I want to do is return this operation. There we go. So now you can see that we've completely finished our parse input function. It's going to get our user input, and then after that, it's going to parse it and return us an operation. So why don't we go ahead and test this? First thing I'm going to do is store this to a variable. So I'm just going to say user input is equal to get user input. So remember, we're going to store the output of this function to some variable. And then what we're going to do is print, right? So we're going to print something, and we're going to print the output of parse input, which takes in an input of whatever we got from this. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. First, we're going to enter our command. So I'm going to say add 30, 50. And now, although this might look weird, this is kind of the sign that you should get. It says an operation object, which means we are getting an operation back. If we want to check this a little bit more thoroughly, we can actually go and print a piece of the class. So you can say the operation that is stored under, what we actually need to do is parse input, because remember, this returns our operation. And in fact, just to make this a little bit cleaner, I'm going to remove this and store this under an operation variable is equal to parse input. And then what I'm going to do is print the operation dot name. So operation dot numbers. So what this is going to do is get our operation, and then it's going to take the numbers from here and print it. Let's go ahead and see if this works. Add 30, 50, and you can see it prints 30, 50. Now don't worry about the strings. We will be fixing that in a later video for debugging, to point out a really kind of nasty part of bugs here, or for loop, sorry. So we're going to be fixing that in a later video, but for now, we've set up our 2 functions, and we're going to keep moving forward so we can start working with this. All right, let's move on.